I'm glad that my colleague from the other side has moved to limit debate, because this hearing, to put it bluntly, has sucked. There is one thing that Republicans and Democrats seem to have in common today, which is that we're willing to be players in a game. Both sides, at times, using this hearing to take shots at our favorite political nemeses. And I see some members practically patting themselves on the back when they get a good insult or counterpoint in. But this isn't a game. Oversight isn't a game. Under this Republican majority, we have wasted month after month censuring, expelling, holding people in contempt, and almost impeaching. And for what? Okay. Republicans have passed nothing of substance in the House. What our Oversight Committee should be doing, instead of spending now dozens of hours arguing about Hunter Biden, is real oversight of issues that affect all Americans, like corporate price gouging, unconstitutional government surveillance, and waste at the Pentagon. The fact that members think that real Americans outside of this partisan environment on Capitol Hill care about this is everything that is wrong with Washington. So that Americans who love this country and just want a better future don't have to listen to hours of frustrating attacks and procedural debates in a partisan game, let me sum it up. 1, there is zero evidence of President Biden doing anything wrong, including in connection with his son. No evidence of an impeachable offense, not a little, not something, none. 2, Hunter Biden has offered to testify in public in front of this committee. If Republicans only want his secret, private testimony, that is, as the kids say these days, sus. If my Republican colleagues are truly in this to get answers, and I hope they are, stop wasting all our time on holding Hunter Biden in contempt on a deposition and ask him your questions. He'll be here under oath, and the American people can watch. What's more transparent than that? What's better accountability than letting the American people hear Hunter Biden's answers? That's real accountability, not political gamesmanship behind closed doors. This is a game where nobody wins and everybody loses. It is Washington at its worst. And I'll tell it like it is without pointing the finger at either party. This sucks. I yield back.
Does any further member wish to debate on the Frost Amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Palmer.
I appreciate the gentlelady's remarks, but I do want to point out that one of the reasons it's necessary for Hunter Biden to appear to give a deposition is that he is a material witness in an ongoing investigation of potential corruption at a very high level. I think, to your point, that this has devolved into partisan politics. When we have an obligation as members of this committee, a very solemn responsibility to pursue evidence and investigate charges legitimately and not let it become what it has become today. And I don't think we're getting there. I do think that Hunter Biden has a responsibility to respond to the subpoena through his legal counsel, if he so chooses, in a responsible way. What he did in showing up outside the steps of the Senate is contemptible. He shouldn't have done that. But we need to investigate this. We need to follow the evidence. And he needs to appear as a material witness to an ongoing investigation. If he comes in to testify before this committee, there are other issues related to his activities that I think would be germane. But I really believe at this point we need to move forward to this. And frankly, I think Hunter Biden should have responded to the subpoena and either himself or through his legal counsel. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Was that my recognition? Okay, Ms. Porter. All right. Mr. Lohmeyer, do you agree with President Trump's executive order 9981?
Well,
excuse me, President, I'm so sorry.
You'll have
to
explain
again.
what you mean. I don't know
Let me start again.
executive orders by number.
Do you agree with President Truman's order that integrated the armed services despite the fact that separate but equal was still the law of the land at the time?
Let me say that this is an important point. The congressman to your left has said he wanted to find common ground. There's a lot of what the general has said today that I don't disagree with whatsoever, but that seems to me irrelevant to the discussion of progressivism as an ideology in the military workplace. Let me point out one example in answer to your question of what I am opposed to. Reintroduction of segregation,
Reclaiming my time,
which
Mr.
is
Lohmeyer.
a
Reclaiming my
direct
time.
consequence
Mr. Chair, it's my time.
of DEI initiatives. We've got
Mr. Chair, I'd like to
commanders who are
reclaim my
reintroducing
time.
segregation because of DEI, and I'm happy to talk to that.
Mr. Lohmeyer, I'm going to try again. Do you agree? I appreciate that you have opinions and you're entitled to have them, but I'd like you to try to answer the question I'm asking with respect, sir. Do you agree with President Truman's Executive Order 9981 that integrated the armed services despite the fact that separate but equal was still the law of the land at the time?
I agree that the military has led the way in integration and unity, which has been the strength of the United States military, but we're undoing it all with diversity, equity, and
reclaiming my
policies.
time. That decision was progressive at the time. In other words, the military went to a place of integration and efforts to have black and white soldiers working alongside each other. It wasn't always perfect, it wasn't always easy, but it was literally the definition of progress and progressive. It went beyond existing law. General, did Truman's actions to integrate the military under EO 9981 lead directly to any readiness deficits? You're a military historian.
No, in fact, the first thing it did, Congresswoman, was integrate Arlington National Cemetery.
Mr. Lohmeyer, you were in active duty, and thank you for your service, Air Force officer in 2010. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Were there any big problems in military readiness in 2010?
As a young flyer, I never paid attention to what you folks were doing. I never paid attention to reports on readiness, lethality. I simply focused on a mission. It was learning how to fly an aircraft, and at that time, it was training our allied partners and foreign military pilots how to fly jets.
Well, I'm glad, Mr. Lohmeyer, that you were able to focus on your military duties, and it seems to me that your own testimony here is a really good example of the fact that the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell did not cause a disruption in your ability or the military readiness of the Air Force to do its job. General, is there any empirical evidence that gay Americans serving openly has hurt military readiness?
No.
So historically, when the military has been progressive, has gone beyond where other policies may be, has tried to encourage diversity or welcome people to be diverse and to learn about each other, there has been no harm to force readiness. General, could one consider President Truman's executive action a diversity initiative? Right, General Truman's, why am I having so much trouble with this? General, could one consider President Truman's executive action a diversity initiative?
Yes.
How about the 2010 repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
Yes.
So in your view, should the military roll back those diversity policies?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Thibault, do you think the military should roll back those initiatives?
No, Congresswoman, I don't, because the integration of the armed forces in 1948 was a recognition that the military is different from society, and so it should march to the beat of a different drum. And that's why I think it was such a good policy, because it ensured that we had the best. That things changed in 1960 when the military became a beacon for affirmative action and quotas. But I agree with you that it was good policy in 1948.
Okay. And do you have would you repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
No, because it's a means by which the military attracts the best talent. But what I would object to is if the military had a quota for LGBT Americans.
Do they?
On the books. Not that I know of, but they do for black, white, Hispanic Americans, and I think those are...
General, is that correct? I'm not aware. My brother served. He went to the United States Naval Academy. He served 5 years. He served on a nuclear submarine. I don't recall him ever enforcing, being part of, as an officer, any type of quota system.
There are no quota systems, Congresswoman.
I don't recall that being U.S. military policy. I don't remember ever passing a law, since we're in Congress and we make the rules. I don't remember ever passing a law with regard to that. Our military is more effective when it's diverse, and you can't have an effective, diverse team without teaching people how to work effectively together. That's what these initiatives should focus on. I yield back.
Recognize Ms. Porter from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Republicans seem, as Mr. Timmons just did, to acknowledge that immigration can benefit our economy, and they seem to say the problem is unlawful arrival. So let me take them for a minute at their word, and most Americans agree with this, by the way, that lawful immigration is a boon to our country and to our economy. Let's understand why, and then let's look at why that isn't the solution to this problem. Mr. Beer, is the U.S. population growth rate declining?
It's down 90% from its historic highs.
Okay. Can you have a growing economy and a declining birth rate in the long term?
You can have economic growth with a declining birth rate, but it's more difficult.
Okay. And I think we can all look at examples around the world of countries that are struggling with this. So our population will start to decline in just a few years, in 2030, if current immigration and demographic trends continue, correct?
That's right.
So if population does begin to decline, what are some likely harms to the U.S. economy?
Well, look, you look at the Social Security system, if we do not have another 30 million workers available by 2034, then the Social Security Administration expects we will have, then we're facing a situation where taxes are going to have to go up a lot in order to fund the system, and that's going to be a catastrophic hit to taxpayers or to Social Security benefits, one or the other. So that's one example. Obviously, economic growth is going to be impacted as more people retire. We've heard about the employment rate going down. Well, that's because people are retiring, not because fewer people are working. If you look at the prime age employment rate, it's high, but that's not enough to make up for all the retirees that are no longer working.
And Mr. Beer, collectively, even if we just look at Social Security, forget collectively, if we just focus on Social Security, we are talking about, in the next few decades, trillions of dollars of shortfalls that could effectively decimate Social Security.
Yes, absolutely. You're talking about over $12 trillion deficit in the short term.
Okay, so then let's say we agree that we need lawful immigration. And I hear our witnesses and our colleagues on the other side saying, well, lawful immigration, I'm for that. I'm just not for unlawful immigration. So let's talk about this. Of the people who apply, who use the system, and they follow the rules, which I think Americans think we should, they apply for a green card. What percentage of them get it?
That's 3%, so 97% do not get one.
3%. I hear all the time from people that they would like people who want to seek a life in this country to follow the rules and, quote, get in line. But there is no line at all for many, many countries. Can you explain that?
Right, so some countries, you can apply for the lottery, right? If you're from a country without a large legal immigration flow already to the United States. But for many countries, Mexico, India, China, Central American countries, Venezuela now, they're banned from even applying for that green card lottery. So there's no direct path for them. If they don't have a U.S. citizen family member in the United States, they're out of luck unless they are extremely highly skilled individual, PhD, master's degree in STEM, has a chance, again, through the H-1B lottery. So we got lotteries on top of lotteries even for the highest skilled people.
So I think this is a really important point for the American people to understand, and really important for Democrats to stake out here. What is our position on immigration? And it is that immigration is a huge benefit to our economy, from which we all benefit. Whether we are generations past from coming to this country or new immigrants, every American benefits from a strong, stable, globally competitive economy, and we have to have legal immigration to get there. That's platform one, in my view. The second platform is we want people to follow the rules, to have an orderly system. But we have to be honest, despite the efforts of the Biden administration, there is still, because Congress has failed, Republicans and Democrats have failed our economy and the American people because we have not created an orderly system. You cannot wait in line if there is no line. You cannot take your turn if we don't provide a chance to get to the front, to get a chance to apply. So the fundamental problem here is we have a broken immigration system. And what we're seeing in terms of unlawful immigration, we shouldn't be blaming people seeking a better life. We ought to be willing to look in the mirror in this body, in the Capitol, and take responsibility for our failure to update the immigration system and to create an orderly way to boost our economy. I yield back.
Chair recognizes
I'm so sorry, Ms. Porter.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to talk about chronic absenteeism and share a couple things and ask some questions. First, I want to share with you that as a parent of 3 kids, and California, as you may know, has very aggressive absenteeism laws. I have seen that persistent, frank communication that you call for, Dr. Malkus, coming from my kids' schools. When they have been sick and I haven't gotten them called in till the next day, they have been in touch. When my daughter missed 4 days because she was sick, her teacher called to check in on her and find out if he needed to send home a learning packet. So I do think we are seeing schools start to really own this issue, and I think we should encourage that. But I wanted to share with you that I think some of that is happening, and I do think that's something, particularly for lower achieving districts, that we want to be encouraging. One of the things I really appreciated about your testimony, Dr. Malkus, and I think it goes to the point that Ms. Fort just made, is you say things like, some of the most resource intensive and most expensive strategies work the best. And I think Ms. Fort points to targeted intensive tutoring, these kinds of high dosage tutoring programs, and expanded learning time. And so I just want to ask you, those things take money, right?
They do.
And some of that money will, as she points out, go to labor costs. You'd agree with her?
I would.
So do we have enough resources pointed toward addressing, closing the pandemic learning gap, and toward addressing the learning loss that comes from absenteeism?
You know, it's going to depend. Those funds are district to district. We really don't know how much each district has spent. It looks at last estimate, and there's some time lag in this reporting, but $50 billion unspent, pretty late in the game. We will need to have funds to do these things. There's no doubt about it. But I do want to make the distinction here that we should be careful to look at the chronic absenteeism problem as if it's a problem that we can fix with simple, narrow policies. What we're seeing is every demographic group is 75 to 80% up. I mean, across the board. It is a widespread cultural change, and you don't have to be a social scientist to figure out why, right? We missed a lot of school, there was a lot of disruptions, and people are out of the rhythms of going back to school. So I really think it's important for us to recognize this as we need to fight this as, yes, bring the policy game, but this is a cultural fight. And if we can't reset school cultures, and it's not just poor schools, I mean, it's there, but high achieving, relatively well-off schools, they're up 80% too. So I really think that this is a cultural problem, and I want to encourage leadership up and down the board to approach it as such.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to share with you, I think my school has done exactly that, and I have noticed a marked thing. One of the things, I'll be honest with you, that has caused my kids to miss a frustrating amount of school for me as a parent this year is they've been sick a lot. And I think that we've had a rough kind of flu, winter, cold season, and so I have called them, they've just been sick. And one of the things that I think is hard to balance when you're pushing kids and parents to come and turning up that kind of heat, which is important to have that standard, is I have to argue to keep my sick kids home because they say I'll get in trouble if I'm not there. And so I think we have to walk that line. In terms of these programs, Ms. Ford, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about a few of these that are working, like the Virginia high-dosage tutoring program, particularly the Colorado AmeriCorps program on encouraging partnering with families whose kids are not coming to school to get them more engaged. And then I think, I just posit to the chairwoman, With the remaining ESSER dollars, and if we do reauthorize it, I think you all have given us some programs to focus it on. And I think it is appropriate that if we reauthorize any money, we focus it on these programs that are working and are being deployed in states. So I wonder if you could say a little more about them.
Yeah, there's many shining examples that I did have in my written testimony that either from having small tutoring groups of 3 to 4 students with one teacher 3 to 4 times a week like they're doing in Tennessee, to the program that you mentioned in Colorado. And people are finding different ways to provide these small learning groups, whether it's with the teachers, the certified teachers, or whether it's with the AmeriCorps or a college student, or whether it's with grandparents. And I think that's the way that people should be looking at it, just making sure that there's a responsible adult involved in the learning process, and that the actual curriculum is aligned with what the child is learning in school. Other funds are being used for after-school programs that are done with a community-based program. Other programs are about professional learning opportunities. But I will say that when we are talking about accelerating learning, the intensive tutoring and the extended day is where the research points us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope we can work on really focusing some, if there is additional funding, focusing on these proven interventions. I do think, and I want to thank the chairwoman for pointing to this issue, we need to treat this like the real educational crisis it is. The learning recovery is the lack of learning recovery from the pandemic is real, and we don't get anywhere by pretending otherwise.
Thank you. The chair now, and I now recognize Ranking Member Porter for her opening statement.
I'm okay, actually. You can keep them. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. As a single mom of 3 school-aged children and a former 8th grade teacher, I know how important it is that kids learn in the classroom and that we encourage their curiosity. Many members of this committee are also parents, and we all want what is best for our kids. We want them to feel supported and capable. We want them to be learning and be able to attain good, high-paying jobs in the future. Where we as parents can't reasonably teach our kids everything, we of course rely on our communities, including after-school programs and sports, to help fill in the gaps. We rely on our school to help our children learn. And working parents like me rely on educators to keep our kids safe so that we can do our jobs. We're here today to discuss our nation's K-12 public education system. And it's true that in many communities, our elementary and secondary schools barely get a passing grade. I am concerned, though, that over the next hour or more, my colleagues will be more interested in pointing fingers than in fixing problems, more interested in looking backwards than in looking forward. 2 of the fingers that are being pointed are at COVID-19 school closures, and then at so-called woke programs that indoctrinate students. Look, none of us, least of all me, miss the days of Zoom school with people yelling about who's taking up the bandwidth and who's using the iPad right now. It sucked. It was terrible for parents. It was terrible for teachers. And most of all, it was terrible for kids. There's no doubt that COVID-19 disrupted learning. Many kids missed out, and there is a real learning recovery that we need to be focusing on. So I'm not arguing with my Republican colleagues about that point. But the reality is that even before COVID-19 reached our shores, and long before Republicans made critical race theory a rallying cry, K-12 achievement was less than outstanding, less than where it needed to be for us to have a strong, stable, globally competitive economy. In 2019, our national K-12 achievement score was a C. I'll say it again, a C. If we're serious about solutions, we have to start with the facts and look at the real reasons that kids are struggling. There's a long history of unequal and inadequate funding for public education that has not set our kids up for success. And I fear, and I think we need to be careful not to devalue the hard work of teachers. We need to not paint them as agents of indoctrination. Instead, we need to be acknowledging their partnership in raising our kids. We should be using this hearing to discuss solutions and support our states and localities in fully funding K-12 schools, including what we need to be paying our teachers to recruit the next generation of educators. That's how we're going to achieve better outcomes for students. So I want to encourage my Republican colleagues today to look forward, to look for solutions to the problems rather than looking at the past, and to really have a collaborative approach on what we can do to make a difference. Not just pointing fingers at Democrats or at progressive policies, but instead asking what are the best policies for our kid, period, regardless of which side of the aisle they're coming from. Whining about left-wing ideologies, that's not going to bring us closer to solving the challenges of K through 12 education. So if we really want to address problems in our school system, we're going to need to take a closer look at how our education system is funded, how things have changed post-pandemic, and we need to uplift data-driven strategies that are working to educate kids. Elementary and secondary education matters to all of us. Whether your kids are out of school, whether you've never had kids, whether you're glad to see them go in the morning, we all benefit from having a strong educational system where kids are safe to focus on learning. And to get there, we need to find the solutions and make sure that we are adequately funding them. So with that, again, I thank our witnesses. I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back. The title of this hearing is Influence Peddling, Examining Joe Biden's Abuse of Public Office. Look, the impeachment inquiry is dead. If it was on life support, my colleague Ocasio-Cortez just killed it. There is no allegation of a specific crime. President Biden didn't do anything wrong. There's zero evidence of that. And still, both Democrats and Republicans and the media treat these hearings like the Super Bowl. But no one ever wins, and Americans always lose. So I've got a fresh direction for this hearing. All we have to do is cross off the part after the colon. There, just influence peddling. We should have a policy discussion about how to stop government officials from using their positions to get money or favors. Now, that is a real hearing, one that nearly every American, regardless of party, wants us to hold. We could start by talking about how senior executive branch officials can leave public service, wait just 1 year, and then legally become lobbyists for big corporations, scoring their new employers profitable government contracts and favorable regulations. They can even be paid by the big corporations during that short 1 year while they are waiting to become lobbyists as a down payment for their future ability to peddle influence. That's wrong. For the panel of witnesses, by show of hands, as Americans, would our witnesses support extending this 1 year waiting period to at least 2 years?
No, I would.
Okay, so there we go. Republicans, Democrats, even convicted criminals, everybody supports that we should do more to stop influence peddling. This is the kind of good government reform that Americans of all political stripes support. And I should know, in 2022, I passed that exact reform as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act with a bipartisan majority vote. What happened to that amendment? Why didn't it become law? The answer is simple. Nearly 500 former members of Congress worked for lobbying firms. And too many people around here want to follow in their footsteps, and so don't want to make it harder for government officials to become lobbyists. Ultimately, Democratic leadership under then-Speaker Nancy Pelosi let the amendment get stripped out of the final bill. When I offered up the amendment again during this Congress, Republican leadership under then-Speaker Kevin McCarthy never even put the amendment up for a vote. Both parties have let us down on fighting influence peddling and tackling corruption. But I'm hopeful we can begin a new approach in this very committee. The American people should know that regardless of party, should know that an investigation was conducted into whether Joe Biden did anything wrong. We followed the evidence to where it led a dead end. So this impeachment inquiry should end today. And where should we go from here? We should stop partisan attacks on each other and address the real problem. That the American people believe that the rules that prevent corruption are way too weak. To stop politicians on both sides of the aisle from influence peddling. This committee should be working together in a bipartisan way to change the culture of Congress, to crack down on influence peddling and corruption, and just as importantly, to stop the perception of it. Let me give you some facts. I don't even need a whiteboard for this one. 495 former members of Congress work for lobbying firms. 467 members of Congress take corporate PAC money. 78 members of Congress violated the Stock Act last Congress. Clearly, we have our work cut out for us. So let's start the conversation today on what a bipartisan ethics reform package could look like. Here are the organizations that could have come today as witnesses so we could have had a productive conversation. Oversight staff, do you have your notebooks ready? Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, Common Cause, Project on Government Oversight, Public Citizen. With the right witnesses and the commitment to doing what the American people want, this committee can have a real conversation about the problem of influence peddling. And we can pass legislation to create badly needed ethics guardrails. That would be real work, not a real circus. I yield back.
Before I recognize Mr. Timmons, Ms. Porter, I think you are sincere, and I look forward to working with you on that legislation.
Chairman, can we take a 5-minute break? I need to go to the bathroom.
Let us get one more, and then we'll do that. Chair recognizes Mr. Timmons for 5 minutes. Then
Ms. Porter.
On October 7th, 2023, Israel endured a devastating terrorist attack by Hamas. I support Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism, and I would say the same for any other country. That's because Israel should be treated like any other country. That is what Israel tells Congress, and I fully support that. As we consider aid to our allies, Congress should hear every country out. Israel should be treated like any other country. And that is why I signed the discharge petition for President Biden's aid package, so that we can have that debate about appropriate aid on the House floor. And when we do give foreign aid out, we verify that our allies are following the rules. The Leahy laws are supposed to verify that every country is meeting the same human rights standards. Under these laws, again, Israel should be treated like any other country. But is it? Is the vetting process really the same for all countries? Let's pull back the curtain. Mr. Richardson, does the United States vet each unit of a country's military individually before they receive security assistance?
Our vetting process is focused on non-U.S. based NGOs, and so it does not include PIOs and generally does not include foreign militaries. And the way that we do partner vetting in sort of a foreign assistance way.
But do you vet at the individual? Does the Leahy law generally require individual unit level vetting?
I am not aware of the military vetting on an individual unit basis. No.
Well, you were in charge of about 30%. You were in charge of foreign assistance at the Department of State, and the budget for security assistance was about 30% of your total budget. So
yes, ma'am.
let me help you out on how it's supposed to work. We are supposed to do unit level vetting to make sure that each military unit that gets assistance is not violating the law. And that is the way it works. Except, this whiteboard's big, except for 15 countries. 15 countries. 15 countries that include a whole number of other countries. And I'm happy to read them off, but there's a long list of them, 15 countries. So I'm curious if other countries are getting special treatment. Let's say there's potential evidence that a unit of a country's armed forces has committed a human rights violation. And there are exceptions for these different processes. So the special processes call into question if a single objection is enough to stop aid. Is that true? If there's a single, if there's a single objection that there is a human rights violation, does that stop aid?
When there is an accusation of abuse or misuse of U.S. resources in the security space or in the development space, for that matter, you do have the ability to raise that, and that gets vetted throughout multiple processes.
Right, that's how it works, except for who? Except for what countries? Do you know?
I'm sorry, I don't, ma'am.
Except for Israel, Ukraine, and Egypt. Except for those countries. Generally, units would stop receiving assistance immediately, but there's that important concern. So when does aid stop immediately? State Department says that aid should stop immediately if there's a problem. Does it?
It totally depends on the circumstances and situation.
Does it depend on the country that's getting the aid?
It also depends on the country receiving the aid, yes.
So what country does aid not stop immediately under Leahy?
I'd have to go back and look through my notes.
You don't know what country that is? It's only one in the entire world. Guess what? Except for Israel. So look, Congress has been told time and time and time again that the Leahy laws apply to everyone, to every country. And on paper, they do. But when we pull back the curtain, when we do some oversight, not all countries are being treated equally when the Leahy law is being implemented, especially our ally, Israel. Look, if Israel wants to be treated equally, which I'm for, then let's do it. Let's see the Israel-Leahy Vetting Forum standard operating procedure so that we can see exactly how it works, how it is different from other countries, and what would the Department of State would need to change to treat Israel equally. I yield back.
Ms. Porter of California next.
Thank you so much. Republicans have told us today that China poses an existential threat to the United States. Their solution to that is to spend and spend and spend on fancy weapon systems, often built in their districts, that they hope will deter conflict. So now we have aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and tanks to fight a war, designed to fight a war that may never happen. But when Congress does that, what they are not doing is using our taxpayer dollars to address the problems that the Chinese Communist Party is actually causing. China is fighting every day to break international law and to expand its reach. Mr. Mattis, could you briefly describe China's claims in the South China Sea?
They have an expansive claim called the 9-dash line that stretches well beyond any recognizable feature and under the UN Convention, the Law of the Sea, of what would be recognizable territory.
So do you believe this is an illegal claim?
Whether or not I believe it's illegal is irrelevant because there's an international court that has decided that some of those claims are illegal.
Okay, so I want to make that clear. China has taken an expansive, unlawful territorial claim to the South China Sea, and they've ignored international law. This is a very, very clear and important example of China not playing by the rules, not following international law. And that behavior is causing real harm in people's lives, whether that's in the Philippines or in Vietnam. Mr. Mattis, can you briefly describe for us illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing?
It's exactly what you described it, but China, the PRC has a particular role in this given that their deep sea fishing fleet is far larger than any of the other countries. And because it is illegal and unreported and unregulated, it is also a nexus for forced labor, and those ships have been violating the borders and exclusive economic zones of other countries, including in the Western Hemisphere. So I'm not quite sure how far you want to go, but there's quite a bit.
That's perfect. So what we have is Chinese fishing fleets. They're using their fishing fleets to expand their territorial claims, their international power, to exert power over other countries. When they do this in Vietnam, they are attempting to essentially roll over Vietnam. They're just another country in the CCP's mind that is standing in their way of achieving absolutist power over regional and global commerce. So China's trying to bulldoze over Vietnam, including by stealing its fish, and they have largely depleted Vietnam's fisheries. What are the consequences to Vietnam?
There's obviously the loss of economic revenue. There is the sort of impoverishment of local fishers.
How does that help China?
Well, one, most seafood is processed in the PRC, and therefore it sort of makes Vietnam and other countries dependent upon that processed food.
Yeah, so I mean, look, China's ruthlessly expanding its power, breaking the rule of law, and the Chinese Communist Party calls this seeking strategic advantage, in part through what they refer to as the three warfares. General Spalding, what are some of the risks of China being successful in breaking international law without consequence?
I think it emboldens everybody else to do the same thing, and I think that's the challenge here. We've seen a complete breakdown in the liberal democratic order as a result.
So, Mr. Mathis, does Vietnam have the military capacity to secure its exclusive economic zone from Chinese incursions?
No.
So Vietnam can't effectively safeguard its own resources. China's taking advantage of that, and China and the Communist Party are hurting people and breaking international law to become more powerful and ultimately to expand their power in a way that will threaten U.S. interests in the long term. So what is the United States doing about this? Mr. Mathis, which U.S. agency protects global fisheries? Do you know?
I believe it's a combination of the Coast Guard and NOAA, and as I recall, there was an initiative that was run by the NSC that was at the end of the Trump administration and carried through in the early Biden administration to take action on IUU fishing.
So it's the Coast Guard. Do you know how many cutters the Coast Guard has in the Western Pacific?
I'm going to guess somewhere between 0 and 2.
Yeah, 5. 5 cutters to protect roughly 40 million square miles. So look, in Washington, we have a gadget problem. Everyone wants the fanciest weapon systems, but to combat illegal fishing, to combat the influence of the CCP, all you don't need stealth bombers, you don't need an aircraft carrier, you need is a relatively inexpensive Coast Guard cutter and funding for good coasties who want to serve their country. That's the tools that we ought to be deploying today to counter Chinese influence. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the extra time, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair
Recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Porter, for 5 minutes.
Secretary Holland, my colleagues across the aisle have leveled some strong accusations against the Department of Interior today. I am an avid national park visitor. I have been to, I think, 33 and counting, including about 12 since I've served on this committee. These accusations against the National Park Service and your management of it are really concerning. I can't in good conscience drive my minivan with its oversight license plate onto these national parks unless we dissect these allegations. First, Republicans on this committee have accused the National Park Service of providing inaccurate and unreliable backlog figures when accounting for deferred maintenance. They have cited mismanagement, waste, and fraud. What methodology are you using to determine cost estimates for the national parks maintenance backlog, and is it in line with standards used across the government?
Congresswoman, thank you so much for the question. In fiscal year 21, the department transitioned away from estimating deferred maintenance cost estimates based on work orders. We revised our methodology and are now consistently estimating deferred maintenance across the bureaus. We're using accepted industry standard approaches to generate our current estimates.
So are there any uncontrollable factors that the department accounts for when determining the remaining costs of deferred maintenance?
As you noted, we have national parks all over the country. Many of those are old. They have historical buildings and historical inventories on those. Sometimes, yes, it takes a lot more of work to find the carpenters and workers that can work on these historical inventories such as the ones that we have across the country.
And of course, many of these deferred maintenance projects are also in remote locations. The maintenance work requires things that have been impacted by supply chain problems. Extreme weather like a fire or a flood, I know, can not only create new maintenance issues, it could also halt the plan for planned maintenance. So it seems to me like you're using accurate, consistent calculations that are widely accepted across the government. So I want to go to the second claim that I heard my colleagues make. They said that the Department of Interior lacks strategic planning and coordination. And they have cited in the past a September 2023 Office of Inspector General report that did identify numerous weaknesses in the National Park Service deferred maintenance process going back as far as 1999. So these were pretty long-term problems. Secretary Holland, that report, that September 2023 Inspector General report included several recommendations for the National Park Service to address and improve its deferred maintenance process. Has the National Park Service addressed or begun to address those recommendations?
Yes, of course. And I want to assure you, Congresswoman, that the NPS maintenance program is very strong. We had a very complex portfolio of 75,000 assets, from Yosemite's Ahwahnee Hotel to Mount Rushmore to the Washington Monument. There is never a one-size-fits-all for any of these, as I mentioned earlier. And estimates now comply with DOI policy and require less time for field staff to develop. So we're working on all of those issues to make sure that we can do it in
And in
the right
fact,
way.
in January 2024, the GAO also released a report, a new report, on the department's deferred maintenance backlog. What did that report find?
The GAO found that the department was managing the deferred maintenance backlog and selecting projects for LRF funding appropriately.
So we've seen huge improvement. There was a problem, the Department of Interior addressed it, and they addressed it promptly. We see a lot of recommendations that go unaddressed for years. In this case, the agency acted quickly, and the GAO has already told us that there is progress being made. I want to move to the final claim, which is that the department, and this is so ironic as you've been sitting here for hours with your very competent staff, that the department is somehow not engaging with Congress for us to conduct oversight of this deferred maintenance. What do you say to that allegation?
I want to say that our door is open, and in fact, if any member of Congress requests a phone call from any one of us, we work hard to meet that request in a timely manner.
So I think your department's also held some staff briefings. I mean, it seems to me that the Republicans are focused on the wrong problems. Secretary Holland, I just want to close by asking, did Congress increase or cut the National Park Service's budget in 2024?
Congress cut the National Park Service's budget in fiscal year 24.
And did that help the National Park Service deal with its deferred maintenance backlog?
Budget cuts never help us.
So the real problem here is budget cuts. The department has the right system, they have the right accounting, but they can't do those projects if they don't have the resources. Thank you, I yield back.
Ladies, time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
Consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized.
To hear Republicans tell it, the only problem with our immigration system is the border. That's a lie. Our process for legal immigration is badly broken. In 2023, 35 million people applied for green cards, some for economic opportunities, some to bring their families together, and some to flee violence. Of the millions in the green card lottery, what percentage got them? Go ahead, take a guess. 20%? 5%? 1%? Nope. 0.2%. That is wholly unacceptable. This deeply dysfunctional system for lawfully entering the United States worsens unlawful immigration. The two are connected. Congress can fix immigration, not just point the finger at those seeking a better life. Instead of blaming everyone else for our broken immigration system, Republicans should own up to the fact that Congress, under their leadership, is what's broken. I rise to commemorate the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court's decision to desegregate public schools. Despite this landmark case and the integration that followed, segregation in schools has increased by more than 60% over the last few decades, driven by so-called school choice and federal courts rolling back desegregation commitments. Every student should have the opportunity to get a quality education. Federal, state, and local leaders must work hand in hand to reverse the harmful policies, including housing costs, that have contributed to this new wave of segregation. In Orange County, which I represent, students challenged school segregation in one of the first cases of its kind, Mendez versus Westminster, which integrated California schools and laid much of the groundwork for Brown versus Board of Education. As we mark the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, I hope my colleagues will join me in recommitting to fighting segregation. Each year, millions of Americans pay third-party software companies to file their taxes. Having to pay hundreds of dollars in fees just to pay your taxes makes no sense. I championed a program called Direct File to change that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act. As a result, thousands of Americans filed their taxes directly with the government this year for free. Despite big tax prep spending millions lobbying against Direct File, 140,000 Americans, including 33,000 Californians, used the pilot program this year. People want this program. Even better, 9 out of 10 people who used Direct File had a positive experience and said it made them more confident in the IRS. Let's take the win here, Congress. We don't have that many, to be honest. Let's make the Direct File program permanent and available nationwide. I yield back. The DoD plans to buy 2,456 F-35s. And the F-35 is one of the most egregious boondoggles in the history of the Pentagon. But if we're going to buy more of those planes, we should at least make sure that they work. Mr. Belk, if an F-35 engine were to break down at sea on an aircraft carrier, what aircraft would the Navy use to transport that F-35 engine ashore to be fixed?
So I genuinely mean thank you for the question, because I do believe in this committee's oversight responsibilities, and I appreciate the opportunity to thank you for that.
Mr. Belk, come on. What plane would the Navy use to transport the broken F-35 engine?
Congressman, I don't know the answer. I'm happy to take it back and get
Thank you. Vice Admiral Chevy, do you know the answer?
And the question of what aircraft, the V-22 was designed as one of the requirements for the CMV-22 to
So the CMV-22 would be used. It's essentially one of the Navy's two kind of tow trucks. Can the C-2, the other kind of tow truck that the Navy flies, can it transport an F-35 engine?
To my knowledge, the C-2 cannot transport a F-35 engine. In that case, we would put additional spares on the aircraft carrier if we have to have it supported with the C-2. So
you would put additional spares. Okay, I'm going to follow up on that. So the C-2 cannot pick up the F-35 engine because the engine's too large. So we'd use the CMV-22. So the military didn't have the common sense to make F-35 engines transportable by all of the tow trucks it owns, so we're going to use only one of them, the CMV-22. So, Admiral Chevy, why did you not see this coming? Why did you buy F-35s that your infrastructure can't handle?
Ma'am, I'm here as the Naval Commander from an airworthiness perspective to talk about the safety of the V-22. I'm going to have to direct that question back to the appropriate personnel to address the
Mr.
question.
Belk?
Congressman, I'll have to take that back to the department.
So you don't know why you bought F-35s for billions of dollars, and you don't have any airplanes, as we're about to see, that can actually pick up the broken engine and fix it. So On the CMV-22, which is the one plane that we can use to go get this broken engine, let's say that the F-35 engine broke down in the South China Sea while F-35s are engaged in securing our national interests from an increasingly assertive China. Do you know how far it would be to a fully capable maintenance depot, Mr. Belk?
Congressman, I do not.
Mr. Vice Admiral Chevy?
Ma'am, can you clarify your question, please?
An F-35 engine is broken down on an aircraft carrier in the South China Sea. How far is it to get that F-35 engine to a place where we can fix it?
Ma'am, I'm going to have to direct it to the F-35 Joint Program Office to kind of answer that question.
Okay, it is 7,200 miles to a small facility in Australia and 14,500 miles to a full-scale U.S. facility. And I'm sure the CMV-22 would not fly all that distance, but it needs to be able to pick up the engine and get it to the next airport where it can then be flown for repair. Admiral Chevy, how often is the CMV-22 mission capable?
The overall mission capable rate, I do not have that in front. I'm not sure, Gary, if you have
Mr. Kurtz?
I don't have that information in front.
Mr. Belk?
Ma'am, do not have that information.
Guys, you're here for a hearing on this very aircraft. Now, you've been deferring on the F-35, but the CMV-22 is what we're talking about here today. It's the Navy's version of the Osprey. So the data I've seen suggests that it can only fly 44% of the time. It costs $85 million per aircraft, and it can fly 44% of the time. That is absolutely absurd. So if the military has made fixing an F-35 engine that hard for itself, surely you have, as you mentioned, Admiral Chevy, spare engines that you can swap in when something goes wrong. Mr. Belk, has the DoD purchased spare F-35 engines?
Ma'am, I do not know the answer.
No, they have not. So it's going to be tough to put those on the aircraft carrier, Admiral Chevy, when you don't have any. So the only plan we have when an F-35 engine breaks down is to fly it thousands of miles. But to do that, the plane only works part of the time. Mr. Belk, how long, is the CMV-22 allowed to fly from the nearest airport?
Ma'am, I defer that to Admiral Chevy.
Admiral Chevy.
Ma'am, the return to flight criteria was based on the data that...
All right, Admiral Chevy, 30 minutes. So often the CMV-22 doesn't work more than half the time. If it works, it's only allowed to fly 30 minutes from an airport. But these failures both leave the F-35 with broken engines stranded on aircraft carriers. And get this, we're still buying more of these incredibly expensive F-35 jets. And we're doing that knowing that we cannot fix those engines because the CMV-22 is a disaster. And by the way, you all want to buy more of those too. Admiral Chevy, do you stand by this state of affairs? Would you like to blame Mr. Belk or Mr. Kurtz?
Ma'am, the F-35 Charlie readiness levels aboard aircraft carriers is above 90%.
Okay, 10% of the time it isn't ready and the engine might be part of it. I'm asking you, should we spend billions of dollars on F-35s that you cannot repair?
Ma'am, my objective as the Naval Commander is to make sure I deliver the warfighting capability the fleet needs to win at a cost we can afford.
Okay.
The services
my objective,
decide...
Mr. Chevy, Admiral Chevy, my objective as a U.S. Congressperson is to make sure that our tax dollars are being spent to actually keep us safe, not line the pockets of defense contractors for boondoggles. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, it's good to see you here. Thank you very much. Got some questions for you.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Dealing with a flight delay or cancellation is tiring and frustrating, and it often feels like the airlines are working against you rather than treating you as a valued customer. When things go wrong, even getting a refund can be discouraging or impossible, but not anymore. Thanks to the Biden administration's new rule, airlines must now automatically refund customers for tickets and fees when a flight is canceled or significantly delayed. I applaud the administration's rule, and Congress should do even more to stand up to the airline industry. I have consistently taken on airlines who spend tens of millions of dollars each year lobbying Washington to prevent protections for travelers. This Congress, I introduced 4 bills to protect Americans from corporate abuse when they fly, and I'll keep working to hold airlines accountable and do right by travelers. I yield back.
Under this,
I rise to commemorate the 16th Annual Orange County Fire Authority Best and Bravest Awards. This program celebrates OCFA's firefighters and professional staff, highlighting their brave service that keeps our communities safe. For California, fire season is no longer just a season. It's year-round. Climate change has intensified the frequency and severity of wildfires. In this tough environment, OCFA personnel have consistently risen to the occasion, preventing tragedy, protecting lives, and safeguarding homes and possessions. In Congress, I've proudly championed legislation to help firefighters. My bills would boost firefighter pay and benefits and standardize national disaster research to better support their work. Showing gratitude to first responders means supporting them both on and off the job. Congratulations to the Best and Bravest Award winners, and thank you to everyone at OCFA for your outstanding courage, dedication, and resilience. I yield back. So I think it's important before we legislate on something to know something about it. So I know a lot about dishwashers because I'm a single mom, and I load and unload and load and unload and rinse and buy detergent. So I wonder if the gentleman who's supporting this legislation about dishwashers, proposing to be an expert in what the American people want in their dishwashers, would be willing to engage in a little colloquy with me about dishwashers. I would like to yield. Are you willing to engage in this? Representative Duncan, I'd like to know if you know what the average utility cost is a month to run a dishwasher. Nope, he doesn't know. $2 to $4 a month. In other words, about a third of a Frappuccino. $2 to $4 a month. Mr. Duncan, do you know about how much a dishwasher costs, Representative Duncan? Like a mid-range dishwasher? Nope, he doesn't know. About $800, $900, you want to get fancier, like $1,000? Representative Duncan, do you know the best ways, the most important things you can do to make your dishwasher get the dishes clean? No, not a dishwasher expert. Loading it correctly. Mr. Chair, do you know how long it takes to load a what the most important technique is to load a dishwasher correctly? It is loading it correctly. Well, I'm asking. Because what I haven't heard, I've heard a lot about the Biden border, the so-called border crisis. What I haven't heard about is anything about dishwashers. So as somebody who saved and scrimped and was so proud to get a new dishwasher and can tell you a lot about them, what they cost, what kinds of features they have, how to load it properly, which I wish every person, every man and child in America would listen to their wife.
Gentlewoman, another 2 minutes.
Would listen to their spouse about how to load the dishwasher correctly. Those are the most important things that make your dishes get clean. This bill is ridiculous. It is Congress at its worst. A bunch of people who haven't unloaded a dishwasher ever, telling the American people what legislation, what kind of dishwashers they should or should not be able to buy. On behalf of every American woman who's going to load and unload tonight and again tomorrow morning, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields.
7 years ago, the Trump tax scam let the largest corporations off the hook from paying their fair share of taxes. The Trump administration bogusly claimed that slashing the corporate tax rate would raise the average household's annual income by at least $4,000. Unsurprisingly, economists from the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Federal Reserve found that never happened. 7 years later, the bottom 90% of workers still haven't received higher earnings from the tax cut. So where did the extra money from Trump's tax changes go? Straight to the very tippy-top, highest paid earners. They used them to line the pockets of their already wealthy executives and shareholders with $4.4 trillion in stock buybacks and dividends. Congress must end this ripoff.
The chair lays.
Ahoy, gentlefolk of the high seas of legislation. We gather around to speak of a matter that plagues our shores and threatens our treasures, the dreaded scourge of porch pirates. Aye, these scallywags who plunder packages from doorsteps are a blight upon our community, a menace to honest folks awaiting their rightful booty. But fear not, for Congress spots justice on the horizon, the Porch Pirates Act. This mighty bill preserves our treasure and brings justice to those who dare to steal what's not rightfully theirs. No longer shall we be at the mercy of porch pirates. Under this noble act, thieves will face fines or even a stretch in the brig. Muster up, fellow congressional sailors. Let's pass the Porch Pirates Act so honest folk can rest assured that their treasures are safe from those who would plunder them. I yield back.
For what purposes is
from industry abuses. So we need to return to this most basic fact, which I think is getting lost in the debate. If so-called permitting reform guts basic environmental protections, we've lost sight of why we do permitting at all. We can and must, and I think my colleagues on my side of the aisle today, the Democrats, have repeatedly said this. We are in favor of speeding up permitting timelines in ways that do not sacrifice the health of the people of this country. And there are common sense solutions. For example, as my colleague Mr. Levin mentioned, funding the agency staff needed to responsibly review projects, as Democrats did through the Inflation Reduction Act. And guess what? We're already seeing the benefits of that. And let me tell you about a bipartisan solution right in front of this committee with zero opposition. My bill, the Electronic Permitting Modernization Act, passed out of this committee by unanimous consent. My co-sponsor, Republican Doug LaMalfa, sitting right here with us today. Unanimous consent out of this committee. What would that bill do? It would centralize links to all of the Department of Interior permitting systems on a single web page to make it easier for Americans to apply for permits and for us to make sure the permitting process is efficient. But thus far, Mr. Westerman, Chair Westerman, and the Republicans have, for some reason unknown to me, refused to bring it to the floor. So much for a serious commitment to permitting reform. So instead of discussing actual bipartisan solutions and moving them into law, we are once again discussing cutting the public's access to justice and biased environmental reforms. Who does this benefit? How does it help? Let's look at just one major loophole. Under current law, NEPA analysis is required for any major federal action, including those funded by federal dollars, which makes sense. But under this bill, projects would be exempt from NEPA review if they are considered major federal actions solely because they are federally funded. So we heard Mr. Carl, my Republican colleague, say that we should streamline permitting. I'm willing to talk about streamlining permitting, but what this would do, Mr. Westerman's bill, is exempt projects from permitting entirely. So it's dishonest to talk about streamlining when what we're talking about is just gutting and eliminating the process itself. Mr. Beard, would you say that projects receiving public funds should receive public oversight?
Yes, I do.
And why does he give that answer? I'll give you one example. History. It shows us what happens when the government funds large-scale infrastructure projects without public input. Before NEPA was enacted, federal funds were used to construct the interstate highway system. Many of these highways went straight through disadvantaged communities, cutting off entire neighborhoods. In Southern California, where I represent, the construction of Interstate 210 cut directly through central and northwest Pasadena, predominantly black neighborhoods, destroyed thousands of homes and businesses, exposed residents to health hazards, and devalued property. Mr. Beard, would you say that highway project benefited those marginalized communities?
I would say it did not.
It did not. And since then, NEPA has been in place to help us make smarter decisions with taxpayer dollars by listening to communities so that public projects using our public tax dollars are used in the interest of the public, not in the interest solely of private industry at the expense of the public. It's time we put our constituents first. Stop polluter giveaways and get serious about meaningful permitting reform. I'll return to where I started. I have a bill that has garnered unanimous consent of this committee. If you've been listening to this hearing today, you know how contentious it has been. I have done the work across the aisle to get unanimous consent and a bipartisan bill, and yet the chair of this committee will not move it to the House floor. Mr. Chair, before I yield back, I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this article from CNN that documents the involvement of over 250 former officials from the Trump administration in the drafting of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025.
Is there any objection? So ordered.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentle lady yields. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And first, I would ask unanimous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I rise in opposition to this bill, the so-called Fix Our Forests Act. This bill is anything but a fix for our forests, and it threatens to intensify not just the wildfire crisis, but also the biodiversity and climate crises. We appreciate the focus and leadership that Chair Westerman has shown on these issues, and it is clear to me and so many others that our forests are a genuine passion of his. But unfortunately, this bill completely misses the mark and has the potential to do serious damage. Look, last Congress, Democrats delivered. We secured more than $15 billion in historic investments through the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to help keep communities safe, restore healthy ecosystems, and promote healthy and sustainable forest management techniques. We provided resources for the Forest Service so they could treat a record-breaking number of acres without gutting environmental protections. We provided planning resources for at-risk communities. We provided more than $1 billion for staffing and resources in our permitting offices, funds that have already shortened project timelines by an average of 6 months. And we supported better pay and benefits for wildland firefighters, an issue that I've personally and consistently championed. It is critical that our federal land management agencies and their partners have the resources and staff capacity that is required to promote resilient forests and safe communities. So it's shocking that most House Republicans voted against those two successful popular laws, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It's also shocking that right at the moment, when a lot of those investments are close to needing reauthorization, the majority is turning its back once again. And it's a stark contrast with the bill today. That is not for lack of trying on our side, but unfortunately, our Republican counterparts in House Natural Resources have refused to work with committee Democrats on changes to the most egregious sections of this bill. I was optimistic at seeing several amendments filed by Democrats that highlight the missing pieces of this legislation. These included an effort to consider climate change in the bill, add authorizations for much-needed funding throughout an otherwise unfunded bill, and to rid this bill of the unprecedented and dangerous sections that strip Americans of access to the courts under the guise of litigation reform. Of course, these amendments were not ruled in order, supposedly due to Republican floor rules and procedure. Rules and procedures that apparently apply only selectively, because this bill has a slew of violations throughout, including numerous violations of the cut-go rules that are allegedly so important to the far-right Freedom Caucus. I hope those Freedom Caucus members know what they're being asked to vote for. So what's in this bill that is so important that cut-go no longer applies? Well, the heart and soul of this bill is a long-standing Republican wish list of priorities that undermine science-based management decisions, undermine bedrock environmental protections, and undermine opportunities for community input. The so-called Fix Our Forests Act inappropriately stretches the credulity of NEPA's emergency authorities. It undercuts the popular and bipartisan Endangered Species Act, and even makes it more difficult for communities to challenge proposed projects in their own backyards. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the safety of our communities all converge in our nation's forests. Unfettered backcountry logging is not the answer. We need to support communities, not silence them. You know what else is not in this bill? Unlike the fire response laws that Democrats passed last Congress, there is nothing here about firefighter pay. What kind of fire response bill doesn't include pay for our firefighters in it? Are you kidding me? H.R. 8790 sets a dangerous precedent. The climate crisis is now. The wildfire crisis is now. We shouldn't be wasting our time on rushed bills with no real solutions. Many of the Republican initiatives here have already stalled in the 2025 Farm Bill process. A better strategy to address the wildfire crisis would be to work across jurisdictional boundaries and with our Senate colleagues to find true consensus. We should be passing regular appropriations bills this week so that agencies like FEMA and the Forest Service have the resources they need and are not scrambling at the end of the fiscal year to find ways to fulfill their existing mandates, let alone the new and unfunded ones in this bill. This is a live issue, by the way. The chief of the Forest Service has warned us explicitly that they are facing budget shortfalls due to Republican-led appropriations bills. In fact, just on Friday, the Forest Service announced that it had to halt 2025 seasonal hires amid the budget crunch. We also need to work on providing relief and support for the communities that have been devastated by wildfire, instead of trying to have federal agencies undertake extensive management projects in their backyard without any true consent. And we should be passing legislation that pays our federal wildland firefighters and gives them the benefits that they deserve. Another major priority that this bill fails to advance. The Forest Service is already stretched dangerously thin, and federal firefighters are chronically underpaid. If we genuinely want to protect our communities and environment from devastating wildfires, we must prioritize people, ecosystems, and the economy. This bill fails to do each of those things. I reserve my time.